So thank you all for participating and joining this panel today. My name is Sarah McKinnon, and I'm an associate professor of communication arts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I do a lot of work with the Institute for Regional and International Studies. And so that is, I think, the reason and why I was asked to moderate this panel today. So I will be moderating for you today. Today's sponsor is the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center. So IRIS NRC supports and enhances global awareness, and it inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. The NRC provides resources and expertise to K through 12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. I will also want to thank our co-sponsors for today's book club, which include Middle East Studies Program and the Center for South Asia at UW-Madison. And I really encourage you to visit their websites and follow them on social media if you're interested in those two areas of study and inquiry. For us today, Carmen Pitts will be running tech support. So if you have any challenges, you can use the chat function to contact Carmen. As you've probably noticed, we will be recording today's event and we'll share the link as well as digital resources in a post-event email. So keep an eye out for that. You will only show on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. So you can keep that in mind if being recorded in that way is something that you'd like to not participate in. And in terms of the Q&A for today, what we're going to do is to have you enter any questions that you have in the Q&A in the chat. So if you, at the bottom of your screen, if you click chat, that will bring up the chat box and you can put any questions that you have there. And please wait until the last 15 minutes of the event. So we can have all of the questions together and then have a really lovely conversation. So before we get started, I want to make sure we acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejop, since the time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations in Wisconsin. So I want to move from that acknowledgement to introduce our fantastic speaker for today. I'm very excited about this talk. Randa Abdel-Fattah is a Palestinian Egyptian Muslim writer, academic, anti-racist, and Palestinian advocate, a former lawyer, and the multi-award-winning author of 11 books published in over 20 countries. Just saying that makes me exhausted thinking about the amount of words that Randa has written and shared with us. Several of her books have been adapted to the stage in the United States and Australia. Randa is also a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Sociology at Macquarie University. Her latest book is Coming of Age in the War on Terror. Randa lives in Sydney, Australia with her husband and 4 children. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to now pass it over to Randa and we will get started with this fantastic presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all. And I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking on the lands of the Darug people and that this is unceded land and that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be addressing you, and I thank you all for investing the time and emotional and intellectual energy and labor to engage with my book. This talk is for me quite personal because what fired me up as a child, a teenager, an adult to care about social justice is very much rooted in my lived experiences. And so in order for me to talk to you about what led to me writing The Lines We Cross, I really do want to talk to you today about the experiences that motivated me to talk about these issues of social justice in my work. and also to pay tribute to the knowledge I've gained from writers and scholars and activists and artists who have pushed my thinking, who have taken me on wild intellectual adventures and provoked me to think in new ways about how and why we fight against injustice and how we can reimagine what is possible in the world. So during my presentation, I'll share with you some practical exercises that I use with students to help them develop critical thinking skills, which I believe are the foundation for understanding what it takes to work ethically towards challenging injustice and inequality in the world. So The Lines We Cross is part of my larger body of fiction and non-fiction writing, which is driven by an idea articulated by Black feminist scholar activist Bell Hooks. The place of marginality can be the place of organization, creativity, and transformative power. My writing is interested in delving deep into the spaces of marginality from which resistance against injustice is forged. Significant labor is exerted in these everyday interpersonal spaces by and between marginalized communities to destabilize the harmful impacts of racism and state violence. And I try in my work to shine a light on that transformative activism of communities, of people and young people whose efforts are often relegated to the margins. The effort it takes for a teenager to stand up for themselves in a school playground, to challenge a teacher, to confront a peer, to question the prejudices of their family, to think critically about the way society is structured, to risk popularity for a principle should be something we honor and validate because of how much courage and integrity it takes. And this is what I seek to do with my writing, and in particular with The Lines We Cross. It should come as no surprise that for me, social justice begins with storytelling, because social justice is ultimately about wrestling with questions around relations of power. And it's through stories that we can bring to life in vivid detail abstract concepts like power imbalances, fairness, equality, consequences. So today I'll share some of my stories with you in the hope that I can inspire and connect with you and spark some ideas for you teaching social justice in your classrooms. So I came of age, we're going to rewind here, in the context of the first Gulf War. When the US struck Iraq in August 1990, I was 12 years old. I was sitting in the back seat of my babysitter's car on the way home from school when I heard the news on the radio. This was before social media. The stories about the impact of war that we were hearing on long distance calls to family in Kuwait and then Jordan were missing from the TV news bulletins. For the society I was growing up in Australia, the society I was born in, Arabs were nameless and faceless. We munched on popcorn in the cinemas as we watched Disney movies, which reinforced dehumanizing stereotypes about our culture and heritage. The next year, year 7, I started at the first Islamic school in Australia. I remember vividly the graffiti on the walls as we arrived at school, "Go back home, terrorists." I remember vividly that our school bus was vandalized to the extent that they had to remove the name of our bus from the school, the name of our school from the bus. I remember walking with the hijab, the veil, which was part of our school uniform, and being spat at. And I remember the time, because my mother was the deputy principal, arriving early at school to find that there had been an arson attack and half the school had been burnt down in a hate crime. And I could never forget the time we arrived at school and a pig's head had been thrown and smashed through the office window with the words "terrorists." Political and media rhetoric demanded Arabs in Western societies prove their loyalty, prove they were not Saddam loyalists, and choose, in my context, are you Australian or are you Arab? Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, none of these existed. I say this not to conjure some romanticized nostalgia for a so-called simple pre-digital era, but to give a sense of the context in which political awakenings and expression and participation come alive, the possibilities and limitations. We had no Twitter or Instagram accounts from which to speak our truth, no TikTok platforms from which to dance our resistance. In the early 90s, our stories, our humanity was silenced until one day in year 8, 1992, my teacher, an English teacher, taught us the art and craft of writing a letter to the editor. Feels like something from the dinosaur era now. But we would post our letters to a newspaper and hope against hope that it would be published on the letters page, the page on which supposedly the voices of the masses could be heard. It was the extent and possibilities of our political participation in the mainstream. It was all we had available to us. And so we practiced writing. This is how we would change the world, we thought, one letter to the editor at a time. It was always a question of telling our story in a society in which our stories were marginalized or demonized and dismissed. As young as 14, I learned that my activism had to begin by fighting for my right to speak my truth. And this is what I am so passionate about with Mina, who is confronted with the same question when she starts attending her new school. How can she speak her truth? I learned that I had to understand the system that was stacked against me and other minorities, and to fight for the right to a space to speak our truth. The stage for social change has evolved. The props and scripts and casts of characters are completely different now. As educators seeking to ignite in students a passion for social change, we need to understand, and we're probably all there already, that the tools and platforms that matter to them and to us, on which today's activism unfolds, has changed. In my day, it was that letter to the editor, and today the public square is online. The soapbox is your social media account. So how can we as educators harness young people's creativity, their online participation into acts of conscience and political action? One thing I've learned in my own feminism, my own activism, is the importance of knowing when to speak up and knowing when to listen. And this is part of Michael's journey towards understanding the humility that is needed to listen and to do the work, to do the labor of figuring things out. Being an ally, I have learned being an ally and have been offered allyship is not about simply sitting down and doing the work of educating people who don't want to put in the effort themselves. We need to be able to get to a point where people take on that responsibility genuinely. And there's a statement in the book which I wrote very much as both a statement of what it means to be an ally and also as a feminist statement, when Mina says to Michael, you want me to make it easier for you to confront your privilege because God knows even anti-racism has to be done in a way that makes the majority comfortable. Sorry, Michael, I don't have time to babysit you through your enlightenment. The first step would be for you to realize that you need to figure it out on your own. And this is a statement that came to me very much from my own experiences of people approaching me and asking me, well, why will you tell us why are Muslims not terrorists? Or why do you think that you have the right to open a mosque in this neighborhood? The questions are always disingenuous, but also even those who genuinely want to know, once I put in the labor, and many minorities feel this way, there's no reciprocal effort put in. And so for me, I really wanted people to, with this book, to understand that the self-accountability, the need to take ownership of what you need to learn and to take those steps yourself. One exercise I found effective, and I say this not only as a writer and academic, but also as a mother of 4 children, 2 of whom are teenagers, is how to sift through information, how to know where to go, who to listen to. It clicked to me when my son, who's 13 now, started on TikTok and started coming to me after the Me Too movement with videos that had somehow gone in his algorithm talking about, well, don't a lot of women falsely report rape? And I sat down and had a massive talk with him about this. And then I started to ask him, who are you listening to? And I realized very quickly that the voices that he was listening to were gaining the most traction online. And it didn't occur to him to critically evaluate, who is this person that I'm listening to? And the deeper that we dug into who he was listening to, we realized this person was a rampant Islamophobe. He has a massive platform, a right-wing activist, and it started to get him to think, who you listen to, what your sources of information are, is so important as a very first step towards trying to understand the world that we live in. So one exercise that I found effective is to actually take these really controversial issues that a lot of schools are scared sometimes to touch and expect kids to just figure out on their own, but actually help kids, help students understand, what resources am I using? As a classroom, let's try and think which is the best website to actually refer to when I want to learn about Black Lives Matter, for example. It would be from the voices of Black people themselves, people actively involved in these social movements, and to try and tease out all the arguments so that they can actually develop a point of view that has been, that they can embrace from a position of knowledge and from critical thinking, rather than just being brainwashed or just taking a point of view that has the most hits on social media. This is also about giving young people these media literacy skills, the critical thinking skills necessary to understand how to sift through the internet, and also try and reach credible activists and organizations and media who are doing the work, and avoid those who are just, keyboard warriors or speaking over communities. And this becomes then a resource for them. And I know this as an activist myself, how many times I'm put in a position where I appear in a media interview and I am on a panel, for example, or pitched in a media interview with another Muslim or another Palestinian who has an extremely populist point of view and almost a self-sabotaging, they might come from a very elitist position or a very classist position, or they against the sort of feminism work that we do. And simply because they are Muslim, they're given that platform or that speaking position. So it's also about saying, well, we need to think critically about the voices that we're listening to. When I was young, so setting all this up and why I started writing, I realized that the cupboards of my house were filled with boxes of, journals and poems, manuscripts and short stories. I've got them all still now. And when I read back on them, and I realized that all the stories are set in America or England, they're all about mainly love triangles in, fraternity clubs in America or English countryside boarding schools. I wrote tragic tales of running away from home, summer camps, all-American proms. My characters ate Twinkies and pretzels, and even the occasional ham and cheese sandwich. My characters' names were as vanilla as they come: Lisa, Samantha, Liz, or Kylie. They always had straight blonde hair, blue eyes, milky white skin. The cliche machine was overtime there. But there was absolutely nothing of my own life or experience in the stories I wrote as a child. Mimicking the teenage fiction I read growing up, my Arab and Muslim identity is invisible in my early writing. I knew from a young age that I wanted to be a writer. In the literary world, there were, of course, stories about Muslims, but never for Muslims. And these stories continue to dominate the most celebrated literary spaces. Nothing titillates the literary world more than the Muslim woman, so-called native informant, who bravely bears all to confess her journey from false consciousness to good liberal, preferably atheist subject. Representations and stories of Muslims in Western popular fiction invariably feature this oppressed woman, accompanied by cover images of women in face veils, their haunted eyes beseeching their white savior author and reader to rescue them. I'll never forget a new teacher arriving at the Islamic school that we were attending. And the very first thing that she said was to us to introduce herself, where she said, to prepare for teaching at an Islamic school, I read 9 Parts of Desire by Geraldine Brooks. And I'm really into the Sassoon, Jean Sassoon books. And we had to sit there and undo all the stereotypes that she had absorbed through these books at such a young age as well. We were so conscious, particularly as young women, that this is the stereotype that we were up against. My mother, as school principal, was regularly approached by media for interviews with students. And I will never forget the time that one of the most popular newspapers in Melbourne, where I grew up, approached the school. They wanted the school to be part of a feature spread of called Faces of Australia. And the photographer came with a journalist and said, we want to include an image of a young Muslim student, Australian Muslim student girl. And my mother immediately, went to a classroom and got, a group of girls. And it was a mix. I attended a school where we had over 50 ethnicities, an extremely multicultural Muslim school. And the photographer looked and said, a lot of these kids, have blue eyes. And there was a lot of Bosnians at the time and Albanians actually at the school, and Turkish students. And said, we want someone with darker features. And my mum said, well, these are Muslim girls. This is who we have at the school. So the photographer was pretty annoyed and took the photographs, and then looked at my mother, who's Egyptian, and said, can I take a photograph of you? And my mother, Egyptian, has very olive dark complexion, brown eyes. And when we went and looked at the newspaper, it was her photograph that ended up in the newspaper. And there were so many times that this happened over and over again in dealing with the media. Whenever they approached us to, when I was working as a media officer, whenever they approached us for an interview and they wanted a photograph, they would always request someone who wore a black hijab or preferably covered their face. So we knew what we were up against when it came to representations. So this insatiable appetite for stories about Muslim women as victims or escapees is part of what motivated me to write my first novel when I was about 16 years old, which I published in 2005. This was my calling. You know, if, as Toni Morrison said, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. My writing came out of this adolescent need to speak my own truth and to speak back to racism. For me, justice was a question of first disrupting hegemonic stereotypes and destructive master narratives about my faith, community, and culture. And I see Does My Hair Look Big in This as the first bookend and The Lines We Cross as the second bookend in sort of my writing career about this issue. Does My Head Look Big in This is so contextual in a very short post 9/11 world, and it's much more about a young girl trying to explain herself and be respected for her decisions. Whereas The Lines We Cross, Mina is a lot more unapologetic and expects Michael and her peers to do the hard work. From a childhood of books populated with characters and stories that bore little resemblance to my own life, this was my attempt to offer a counter narrative. If most people were reading books that typecast Muslim women as oppressed, I reasoned, then that must be what most people were thinking. And of course, Chimamanda Adichie speaks about the danger of a single story, and it so profoundly resonates with my own writing journey. You know, the stories, the principle of power, how they are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told are dependent on power. And power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. I can't tell you how many times we Does My Head Look Big in This, I've been interviewed, and it was first published in 2005. I can't tell you how many times I would be in an interview and somebody would say, so when you did this and when you did that, I say, it's not an autobiography, it's a work of fiction. The idea that I can only, as a Muslim, write a piece of sociology or an anthropology of Muslim life, rather than have the imagination to offer a story of a Muslim in a vast, diverse community, was something that I confronted so many times. But like I said, it started when I was 16. That was when I wrote the first idea, to challenge the idea that there is a definitive story of a Muslim woman, by writing a book about this Australian teenage Muslim girl who decides to wear a hijab while attending a private school in Melbourne. And Amal, who's the character, is the only Muslim at her school, and the story explores how her decision impacts her own sense of identity and her relationship with her peers and teachers. So whereas Mina is attending a school where she is also marginalized in terms of her background and her identity, she confronts the prejudices that come around her background as a refugee. Amal confronts the prejudices that come around the fact that she has embraced her faith and started wearing hijab at this school, and all the assumptions that come with that. And the book, when I first submitted it when I was 16, was rejected by publishers because it was sort of the angry rantings of a teenager, a little bit too didactic. But they were all so supportive, the publishers' rejection letters of the book, because they felt that there still had not been a book written about a Muslim woman and by a Muslim woman in the Western context. So I put that manuscript aside. You know, I knew then that the world wasn't ready for my story. I'll show you the book trailer. Hopefully this works.
What does it mean to be judged by your appearance? Because of the assumptions of others. One girl's convictions and her courage to embrace them. Supported by her friends. Misunderstood by the boy she likes. This is Amal's story, telling you to look past the veil and see the person within.
So I wrote that when I was 16, and I'm still here talking about the same issues. And that's one thing that I try to impart to students, that advocating and working for social justice, you need to understand, because sometimes hope can give way to despair and hopelessness when you don't see any change. But social justice activism and caring about changing the world for a better place, it's not a one-day endeavor. It's not a trendy phase or a performance. It's about shifting power, and that takes dedication, and it's slow grinding work. And one example I give, and this is why when I wrote When Michael Met Mina, when the lines we crossed, and I had the Aussie Values Party, and I also had the fact that party that they were trying to establish was also had a multicultural people within the party who were against multiculturalism. That for me was something that I learned very quickly when I was in first year of university, and somebody called Pauline Hanson emerged on Australia's political scene, and she came to the scene calling for an end to multiculturalism, denouncing Indigenous people in Australia, and rallying against so-called being swamped by Asians. And 20 years later, she changed tune and started arguing we are in danger of being swamped by Muslims. And so when she came onto the scene, I joined a party called Unity Say No to Hanson, and I actually stood for the federal election in that party. And I talk about this to students to show that it takes effort, it takes a commitment, and it's not going to be about sharing one social media post. It's about doing the hard work on the ground. And it's how I opened my talk. The work that we do in those interpersonal everyday spaces is so important in dismantling and disrupting those foundations and structures, because that's what we're up against, the structures of racism. There is only so many people that you can individually rehabilitate and overcome their individual prejudices. But that means nothing if the structures and institutions of racism have not been destabilized. And so I feel very strongly that every victory in a social justice movement is owed to the invisible labor and commitment of people who paved the way. And I owe my successes and my learning and knowledge to those who fought and resisted before me. Young people, we all need to understand that social change is cumulative and every act matters, and that it's not just spectacular activism that counts. Quiet and informal acts of protest and activism in young people's everyday lives are just as important. And that's why the character of Paula is so important, because she is an example in the book of somebody who speaks up. And that moment of speaking up in a classroom is so powerful in destabilizing the normalization of racist rhetoric in a classroom environment, for example, in defending somebody or giving them a platform to speak and listening to them. Those acts we need to honor and validate, and really understand the courage that it takes to do that. No matter how small a gesture is, no matter how mundane and small scale it may seem, in the bigger scheme of things, we need young people to have the confidence to believe that every act of resistance makes a difference. And this is something that Michael comes to understand, particularly in relation to his friend Terence, that it's not enough for him to simply try and undo all the things that he's learned from his family if he isn't going to confront one of the hardest relationships in his life, which is his best friend. And all of us, I come from a Palestinian Muslim family, and there are the most appalling racists in my own family. I sit there and I have fights with my Islamophobic Muslim Egyptian uncle. Dinner table conversations are always harder. People that you love are always harder to confront and to challenge than a stranger. And that kind of work needs to be done. And we say this a lot in Australia as minorities, that the heavy lifting and labor has to be done by the white majority in calling up and holding to account the things that you hear at the dinner table, the things that you hear in conversations in the family that become normalized, and actually saying, no, it's unacceptable to say that. I've done a lot of work with young people about their politics in my latest academic project. And I talk about what politics means to them. And one person I spoke to, his name was Mark, he told me how he tries to modify his online behavior when it comes to his news media consumption. He's skeptical about certain media. So he told me growing up in the internet age, the tabloid sort of headlines are something my generation are very aware of, like the idea of clickbait. So I feel like my generation definitely does need sort of to pick up on how misleading these headlines are. There are certain news outlets which are, you can tell, are trying to make big statements. So I try to be selective about where my news comes from, and I refuse to read the tabloids. And after I met Mark, I thought there is so much courage in him refusing. That word is important. It's intentional. There's a conviction and principle behind his personal decision. He's interested in doing something, no matter how small scale, to affect social change. So refusing to read the tabloid newspaper is something that needs to be honored, because it is a stance and it has principle and conviction. And I feel so passionate about this because a whole generation are coming of age in this, so-called post-truth era. They're growing up, and young people I've interviewed have told me this. They're developing a sense of identity and political consciousness in a climate which endorses the notion of alternative facts or post-truth or fake news. And what they face, what we all face, is the notion that is the war against truth and against the disregard for truth. And helping young people navigate this is critical. So these sort of discerning choices should be commended, especially when social justice causes are often rejected and undermined by competing stories presented as equally valid. One other student I spoke to, her name is Kaylee, and she loves makeup and she's on Instagram a lot. And she told me, I'm not political, I'm not a political person at all. And then as she spoke to me, she said, when I'm on Instagram, I try and follow, women of color or Latina women, brands supported by them and brands endorsed by them and for them, so that I can sort of make a difference in, color shades in makeup. And not just assume that, that the beauty community is only for people like me. And she was a white Anglo woman. So she says, I try and follow women of color so they have a bigger audience. And I said to her, well, that's political. That is a choice that you're making. You're using your consumption practices. You're using your social media as a way of instilling some values. And I really felt that a lot of young people I spoke to think that politics is attending a protest rally. And they don't realize, for example, in the lines we cross, that the protest rally is even less political than the classroom, is less political than the school playground. That is where politics is taking place on a daily basis. And so when young people understand that those small acts make a difference, they push and disrupt and challenge, then they can understand that they have agency and they have power. So one exercise I do with young people is to ask them, what does it mean to be political? What do they consider is political? And so it gets them talking about what politics means in their life. And then they start to appreciate that those small gestures can be equally political. Refusing to share a post, which might be funny, but is racist. Thinking about the harm that saying something or sharing something will do to another community, looking at things from another person's point of view. These are political acts. These are acts which contemplate the question of power and power relations. This becomes about more than just social media literacy. It's an indirect lesson in intersectionality, teaching young people that we all hold, different multiple social positions, and that our different backgrounds means we encounter the world differently. I've gone to so many schools and I've, spoken about racism and injustice. And, I will go to a school, for example, which has a large Anglo-white student population. And a young student will say, well, I'm white and I'm male, but I also feel sometimes that, society can be unfair to me. And then, I'll have to unpack to him that where does the starting line start in a society, talk about the structures and talk about intersectionality. And so to be mindful of our own positionality in society. And so what I wanted to now shift to is what directly led me to write The Lines We Cross. I'll just move forward a bit because I want to leave time for questions. I think it's important for this is the kind of context in which I was writing To Lines We Cross. I practiced as a lawyer for 10 years, but I wasn't working, and I was working as a human rights advocate and I was writing at the same time. But this is the society that my children are being raised in. This is the society that my activism is called to respond to on a daily basis. One in which Muslims, particularly at this time, which is around 2012, 2013, were constantly in the news and in the context of the so-called war on terror, made to feel like, the fifth column in society, the securitized suspect community. And it was really important for me to try and make a difference here. And so I decided that I would leave law and that I would start a PhD looking at Islamophobia and race from the point of view of the Islamophobes. And this is actually what inspired me to write The Lines We Cross, this kind of environment. I was keen to understand the subtleties of the spectrum of Islamophobia and mine deep into the attitudes and perceptions of people who harbor anti-Muslim sentiments. And time again, I found that Islamophobia and racism can be explicit and it can be deeply ambiguous. It can be, from the benign actions of people who are unaware of the ways in which they fetishize Islam and Muslims and minorities. And it can be also among those who are explicitly part of groups who believe that, Muslims are subverting the nation and that we need to ban Muslim immigration. I interviewed people who equate Islam to Nazism. I had meetings with people who openly told me, I want abortion clinics set up for Muslim women in Muslim suburbs. And I also interviewed people who said that they tolerate Muslims, or cited the so-called clash of civilizations theory, or that Islam is incompatible with Australian values. I met people who said, I can't handle seeing a halal food label on food. Someone said to me, when I see a woman covered, I can't help but think of a dangerous person, someone who cannot be trusted, terror and hate. And it was these examples and people that I met that actually provoked me to think about the need to write a book, not just a PhD that only academics will read, but a book that comes from this world and what I was learning for younger audiences. And the inspiration for The Lines We Cross actually came to me when I was attending a protest, and it's the opening scene of the book, but it was actually a protest that I was invited to by one of the people I interviewed. He said, we're holding an anti-refugee protest. You come there and I'll introduce you to the people to interview. This was in 2013, early 2013. And I really struggled with that decision as to whether to attend. I ended up attending. I think I stayed for 25 minutes. I couldn't really handle it at all. And there it was, that's where I met people who were more on the extreme fringes. At that time in 2013, these people were nobodies. They really were on the fringes. By the time I wrote my PhD, and finished it in 2016, I cannot tell you how quickly they had mobilized. They became part of movements that were now on the streets, Reclaim Australia rallies. The people that I met for coffee who were crying to me and lamenting that nobody listens to them were on the news now. They were the front image and the poster boys and poster girls of these movements, which had so quickly become normalized. And there was a direct link between that and the political rhetoric that was allowing this in the name of free speech. The characters of Michael's parents were directly inspired by people that I met, two people in particular. And these, for example, were directly taken from some of my interviews. This idea that the father and mother keep saying that there's a dominant culture, that we're based on Judeo-Christian values. You're free to practice your religion, but it's always conditional. And this is something that came up time and time again. Then there was also this politics of resentment and this sort of affective resentment towards anything that was considered multicultural, that it was seen as a takeover. And a Chico roll is an extremely Australian takeaway food. It's pretty awful, but it's something that's fried with vegetables inside, and it's seen as something that you would buy at a petrol station, a gas station, or a takeaway shop. And there was a person that I interviewed, and he spent about half an hour telling me there's going to be no more Chico rolls in this area because it's seen as a quintessentially white Anglo-Australian sort of hot chips kind of food. And he said, because the Asians and the Arabs are all taking over with their food. And that's why I put that line in there, because food has this visceral reaction in these racist discourses. And these are the sorts of encounters that inspired a lot of the people in the book. The parents, when I first wrote The Lines We Crossed, the parents were a lot more extreme and unlikable. And then as I started to reflect on the people that I met, I realized that it would be so easy for my readers to dismiss the parents. Oh, they're so extreme, they're on the fringes. And that would allow them to then disassociate themselves from that racism. I needed to make the parents more likable. And this is the hardest part of what it means to fight racism. The benevolent people, the kind people, the people who, are polite and sweet and generous, but hold the most appalling racist views. Standing up to them, you usually, there's so many encounters and they'll refuse to acknowledge their racism. But those microaggressions, which come from a space of so-called benevolence and kindness and politeness, is really difficult. And that's when I said before, those interpersonal spaces of resistance and activism are so important to honor, because it takes courage. It's nothing more difficult than standing up to someone that you work with who is, by all intents and purposes, quite a nice person, but then says something really racist or delivers a microaggression. And as soon as you stand up to it, you are suddenly the one that's on the defensive and seen as aggressive. And this is what I wanted to do, to allow readers to actually own that kind of a person, which is someone who's a lot more common in our daily lives, and to also see, well, what are the ways that I can maneuver my way to be able to resist and confront that kind of racism. And that's what Michael has to confront. All right, I'm going to cut it short because I do want to hear from you all, and just end with one more thing about Mina. So Mina obviously is born out of a refugee story narrative, which is again central to my own anti-racism advocacy. And in Australia, we have such a strong and powerful anti-refugee machinery. We have offshore detention, mandatory detention, and it's actually really horrific what refugees and asylum seekers have to confront. And so with Mina's story, I really wanted people to understand what it feels like to be racialized in that way, to have to fight for your humanity on a daily basis and still have to deal with the trauma of what you have endured, and the idea that certain lives matter and other lives don't. And so she's constantly talking about, first of all, the question of class and intersectionality, that the world that she comes to, people take for granted their wealth and luxury and privilege. That's the first thing. But then also in the so-called war on terror and the so-called locking up of refugees, what counts as a human? Who do we feel sympathy for? And this is something that she challenges young people, the people around her, and Paula does too. Why is it that some people are considered civilized while they bomb and kill, whereas me as a refugee who has experienced all this trauma, and my people who are killed in the name of your civilization, we're not considered as human? And so it's really about trying to, again, get my readers, young readers, to understand and confront and develop this critical thinking about who counts as human. What does it mean to understand our privilege in the world, and who do we feel sympathy for, and who do we honor, and who do we reject and demonize? I'll leave it there because I want to really give you a chance to ask me questions.
I'm happy to get us started. I wanted to, one of the themes that I really found just really insightful, both in the book and the talk, is the way you're drawing on kindness as a sort of theme that's kind of something we need to push against with social justice work, right? The benevolent racist, but also something that's necessary in doing the work of social justice. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, both how it's, a dynamic that is hard to push against and hard to work against, but also something that's necessary as we're doing the work of social justice.
It's such a great question. It's something I'm so interested in with my activist friends, because we feel that there are lots of activists, and we feel this in terms of the lateral violence that sometimes we experience from other activists within our community, who can have quite toxic and harmful ways of delivering a message, or the ways of intervening in their anti-racism work. And so this is an ongoing conversation about the fact that if there's no ethics of care, then what are we fighting for? If it's going to simply be about, we want to dismantle, we want to disrupt, we want to destabilize these powerfully harmful institutions and structures. But we need people to be doing this kind of work in a way that still respects people's humanity and has this ethics of care. We come across this time and time again, that if you aren't conscious of the way that I feel that it's it's necessary to negotiate on a case-by-case basis, that it cannot simply be, one rule fits all. There are circumstances where I do compromise because I feel that the audience deserves my intellectual and labor and investment. And I know that they can do the work on their own, but I will push myself because I feel that there is a genuine curiosity there. And sometimes we need to do that work. Other times I won't, and I will withdraw, and not give my attention and time and investment. These are things that we need to do time and time again. And I think we need to have some patience and some understanding that people's journey can sometimes take a lot longer than others. And I know that some people are very impatient with that, but I think there are moments where we have situations where people are, torn down for saying something or making a mistake, and intellectually it makes sense. Yeah, what they've said is racist, but at the same time, they might be young. They might not understand the consequences. I really do feel that if there isn't a consciousness about the ethics of how you achieve a liberation movement, and the sorts of alliances you build with that, then it will become an unkind, toxic movement. And I'm not interested in that, because we're trying to imagine an alternative way of living with each other.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. It made me think of definitely that ethics of care. And then also sometimes an ethics of care is turning to the self-accountability that you began the talk with and saying, okay, a part of this is you doing some of this work yourself. And so I'm going to, gently put this back on you to do some of that work. It looks like we have a question in the chat from Daniel Collins. I'll just read it aloud and then we can, I'll pass it on to you. So Daniel Collins, the ethic of care is so important. Thank you for that, Randa. Particularly in the classroom, how have you developed and maintained that ethic of care in the classroom grounded in social justice?
Yeah, well, I learned it in the classroom because being there since 2005, standing up in front of classrooms and talking about what it means to be a Muslim woman, I can't tell you how many times students would ask me the most offensive and insulting questions. Students would say, "Are you circumcised? Did your parents force you to marry your husband? Will you make your daughter wear the hijab?" They would ask me questions that were deeply offensive, and I learned very quickly that I had to allow them to ask those questions, but I had to also hold them accountable to the consequences of asking somebody that, and teach them, use it as a teachable moment so that they didn't think that it was okay to ask that, but to also recognize that there was a curiosity that came out of a culture of misinformation and misconceptions and misunderstanding. And it's very contextual. If somebody asks me, if I go to a class now, and they say, well, aren't all Muslim terrorists? I will respond to that very differently than the way I did in 2002. And I think it's important that we actually understand when a question is genuinely being asked from a place of ignorance, from somebody who wants to learn, and if it's asked in a more mischievous and sort of devious sort of undertone, I think you pick up very quickly on that. And teachers, nobody knows their students more than teachers. You know your students more than their parents do, so very quickly how to manage that. But it's another important point, that I want to make in a classroom is that you're managing people, a classroom of intersectional students as well, and so sometimes their questions can hurt their peers. And it's always about managing that dynamic as well, getting them to understand, what is the impact of my question? What is the impact of my statement on somebody sitting next to me who comes from a background in which that statement is offensive? And if we can teach anything, it's not just this kind of, this trope of empathy. It's actually, you can't teach empathy if people don't understand intersectionality. If they don't understand that our experience of the world is totally contingent on our social locations, and most people, let alone most young people, really need to understand that, you know, I've said it so many times. Well, people will say to me, but Australia is a really fair place. Well, I said, well, have you asked an Indigenous person or an Indigenous child disproportionately incarcerated in Australia? You need to have the imagination to see that not everybody experiences the world differently, the same.
That's really great. We have some comments in the chat. Thank yous, appreciation, just for developing these characters and bringing this to us. I want to continue with this theme that we were talking about. So one of the things that struck me as you were talking is the sentence where you said a rally is less political than a classroom or a playground. And I think like what you were just getting at about the intersectionality that's present in a classroom, and maybe also the multi-directionality of communication, but also the institutional rules and regulations and governance helps me to make sense of that. But I just thought I would give you some space to elaborate on that. That was helpful for me as I think about my social justice work.
Yeah, well, it's my children actually who taught me that. So, you know, I spent so much time in social movements, you know, doing my activism work in community. And sometimes I forget that I'm going to go home to my teenagers who come home grumpy or upset because of something that's happened in the classroom. And I might dismiss it as, you know, it's not important in the scheme of things. But then I realized, but that is their world, and that is the world where they're learning what's acceptable to say, what it means to feel the harm and impact of somebody's statement or comment or insult, boundaries, where they're learning boundaries. But also, and this is something that I take up with my academic work, because I look at the school as whether students feel school is a safe space. And I interviewed Muslim and non-Muslim students in over 150 students in Sydney, and asked them, do you feel the safety and freedom to speak up and to be political in your classroom? You know, I don't mean chanting with slogans, but do you feel that you have the ability to question what you're learning, to ask questions about the world? And most of the Muslim students I spoke to said no, because we're scared we'll be considered like extremists. And there was a lot of self-censorship. There was a lot of, self-management about looking angry, looking too emotional about certain topics, being too invested in questioning things around the war on terror, because there was this idea that it will taint us with suspicion. And the school is the first institution in which the racial structures of society, therefore, are translated to the spaces in which young people are learning who they are. For me, I became radicalized in my politics as a young person, and I was given the freedom and movement to have wild opinions, but it was done in a space that was safe. And that's being really stifled because of the war on terror. And it's so important for teachers, and I do a lot of work on this in that research project. It's so important for teachers to understand. And students said to me, we rely on teachers to set the parameters, to signal that this is a safe space. Otherwise, we will shut down. We will not express ourselves.
Do you have recommendations? I know we have a lot of educators in this call. Do you have recommendations or suggestions about how to do that work of setting the boundaries of safe space for our students?
Sometimes it needs to
and Sandra just asked the same thing. How is it attained? How do we do this?
Well, I mean, when I think about what students said to me, how they picked up that a space was safe. If somebody said something racist or offensive, the teacher shut it down. The teacher did not allow it. So it was very obvious and quickly understood by the classroom that some things would not be tolerated. Students, many of the Muslim students, and this doesn't just apply to Muslim students, it applies to, all minorities, they felt sometimes really resentful of being the token, for example, the token Muslim. So if something came up in class and we're talking about something that affects Islam, or we're learning about religion, some teachers would immediately go to that student as the ambassador for the Muslim world and ask them to explain and defend. And I spoke to one girl, she said, I had no idea about 9/11. I really loved fantasy books, and suddenly I was going home and having to read up on 9/11 because the teacher kept asking me questions. That's not a safe space, because that student is feels the pressure of being an ambassador as a representative, that burden of representation. So it's that dynamic, you know, accounting for every student as an individual, not as a representative, was something that the students constantly spoke to me about. You know, being appreciated for their individuality, not as this representative ambassador for a larger community.
Absolutely. Julie in the chat writes, I heard once that what you permit in your class, in essence, you support. Powerful statement in regards to safe spaces. And, you know, here in Wisconsin, I have to say, like, that is such a powerful thing to keep in mind. I think the kind of white Anglo codes here oftentimes mean that when there's discomfort, you kind of like avoid it and go around it, but that silence then is marking something for students that that can then signal that it's not a safe space for various communities to participate and ask questions. And so I think that that's really, really powerful. We have about one more minute left in this session today. It seems like we have maybe one more question here that we can end the session with. So Jada asks, do you believe that academic spaces are the only places where students and youth can be inspired to practice social justice, activism, etc.?
Absolutely not. So I believe very firmly that it has to start young. My youngest is 5, and then I have a 7-year-old. So I've got two ends of the spectrum, the younger kids and the older ones. And I'm starting from the youngest age because, you know, understanding the values of equality and justice and fairness has to start young. And it has to be embedded in the books that we read to them, the conversations that we have with them. You know, I'm one of those annoying parents that watches a movie and then tries to make it a teachable moment with my kids. And I know 9 times out of 10, it's going to go through one ear out the other, but you plant the seeds as often as you can. And hopefully that kind of forest will grow eventually. And so I think we have to start young, and the academic space is the last place, I think, where that kind of work happens. It has to be grounded in community and family, and start as soon as possible.
And it seems like be persistent and enduring and long-term. It's the interpersonal, it's in the nitty-gritty, all of these micro moments that really matter. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking a time to speak with us about your fantastic book. This has been a really lovely conversation. I know I've gotten a lot out of it, and I'm sure our audience has as well. It seems like there's one more comment in the chat, so I will give everyone a moment to read that. But thank you so much for coming and participating in this session, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. And
thanks you so much.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.